Hello everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video I'll be working on this gorgeous golden Labrador, making a start on the eyes and the fur around the eyes. I really love the lights and shadows in this piece, and I thought it would make a great tutorial. I've linked the reference photos along with the material list and line art if you'd like to have a go at drawing along with me. And if you'd like to complete the full Labrador along with access to other in-depth tutorials, then you can head over to my Patreon. So I'm starting off by lightly rubbing out the pencil marks before going in with the coloured pencil, so it doesn't show through. And then I'm beginning by taking a sharp dark pencil. This is the Polychromos Dark Sepia, and I'm starting to map out the outlines of the eye, following the pencil marks underneath as a guide. And I'm getting those details within the eye mapped out too. I'm also starting off by looking at the lighter version of the reference photo, as the details in the eye are quite dark, so this just helps to see where everything is a bit better. And then here I'm just roughly adding in those shadows, going in between those hairs over the top of the eye. And then I'm just adding in that lower eyelid here. Now for the iris, I can see by looking at the lighter version of the reference photo that it has almost like a green-yellow hue to it, with hints of blue in some areas too. But I want to start with a yellow undertone, so I'm taking the Polychromos Light Chrome Yellow, which is quite a bright yellow, and I'm very lightly adding a layer of that to the iris, using circular motions. And then I'm taking more of a yellow-green pencil. This is the Luminance Green Ochre, and I'm again shading in using a lighter pressure and circular motions. I like to start with the lighter colours and build my way up to those deeper tones. So now I'm taking a bit of a darker yellow-green colour. This is the olive green yellowish, and I'm again shading in with a lighter pressure, focusing a bit more around the edges and on the left side here where it's a bit darker. And then if you look quite closely at the reference photo, you'll be able to see hints of blue within the eye. So I'm using the Polychromos Dark Indigo, which is a deep blue pencil, and I'm lightly shading in, focusing on that shadowed area. And then just below the reflection here, I'm just outlining it slightly. Then taking the Polychromos Earth Green Yellowish, I'm shading into the rest of the iris, again keeping a lighter pressure. Now I feel like I can also see some deeper brown tones in there, specifically on the left side by the eyelid. So I'm using the Polychromos Walnut Brown, and I'm shading in by the shadowed area here, bringing my pencil down around the bottom of the eyelid, using more of a medium pressure here. Now for the reflection, it is quite a bright blue colour, So I'm starting off with the Luminance Light Cobalt Blue, and I'm shading the whole of the reflection using a lighter pressure. And then I'm also shading into the inner part of the eye, as I can see that it has a cooler blue undertone to it. And then I'm going in with the Polychromos Phthalo Blue, shading in and focusing on the centre of the reflection, leaving the lighter area around it. And then using the Luminance Payne's Grey, I'm just gently going around the bottom of the reflection. And then I'm adding to the shadowed area at the very top of the reflection. Using the same Luminance Payne's Grey, but making sure my pencil is sharp and working around the details of the eye. The inner corner part here is more of a muted brown grey with a hint of purple, so I'm taking the Luminance Violet Grey to shade into this part of the eye, and then I'm also shading in the inner eyelid. Now that we've got the basic details in, I'm taking the Polychromos Black and I'm working around the darker details of the eye, making sure my pencil is sharp for this. I sometimes like to start on the fur around the eye before the eye is finished, as it kind of helps me to see what I need to add to it. So I'm taking the Cold Grey 232 and I'm shading in right around the eye, using a light to medium pressure. And I'm starting off with a cold grey pencil, as the areas just around the eye are slightly more cool toned. Leaving a bit of a gap here in the middle where the light hits. Bringing my pencil right over the top here, and changing the angle of my pencil as I move around the eye to follow the direction of the fur. Then I'm taking the brown ochre 10% to use as a base for the warmer areas, starting here at the top of the eye, using a lighter pressure. I'm using an ever so slightly heavier pressure on those darker areas I can see, just so I have an idea of where the darker and lighter areas are in the fur. And I'm just focusing around the eye for now, and then I'll add the base colour to the rest of the fur later on. Taking the Luminance Buff Titanium, which is another pencil I use a lot as a base for warmer tone fur, I'm continuing to build up the base colour around the eye, using a lighter pressure. I can see that the fur has some more vibrant orange areas in certain parts, so I'm taking the Luminance Apricot, which is a brighter orange, but still has that creamy tone to it. And I'm shading in just above the eye here, using a lighter pressure, and then I'm working into this patch of fur in the eyebrow area. If you don't own the apricot pencil, you could always use the Polychromos Cadmium Orange, which is quite similar, but a little bit more vibrant. So if you are using this pencil, just make sure to keep a lighter pressure. And then I'm adding a slight touch of colour around the bottom. Going back to the eye for a moment, I'm taking the Luminance French Grey, which is a brown grey colour with a slight hint of purple, and I'm working into the inner corner here, using a light to medium pressure. And then I'm also working around the bottom of the lid. Then from there I'm starting to shade down around the eye, as I can see that grey-brown kind of colour right around the eye. Then using the Luminance Steel Grey, I'm shading into the white part of the eye, as it has that blue undertone to it. And then I'm taking the white Museum Aquarelle pencil to go over this. For those of you that are new to my videos, I like to use the Museum Aquarelle as it's the most pigmented white I've found, and it goes over colour pencil really well. And I'm also just using this to brighten around the reflection here. Then going back in with the dark sepia pencil, I'm just really deepening those darker areas within and around the eye. Now I mentioned earlier how the eye has some deeper bluey green tones to it, so now I'm using the Polychromos Payne's Grey, which is a darker cool tone grey, and I'm using this to really deepen the shadowed area in the eye. Adding in that little bit of detail here, using a medium pressure, and then lessening the pressure as I shade into the lighter part of the eye. And then here I'm shading in just above the eye, using a light to medium pressure. I can see that the colour around the eye has some grey tones to it, but I can also see some warmer browns. So I'm taking the Polychromos Walnut Brown and I'm continuing to shade in around the eye, using a light to medium pressure, following the direction of the fur as I shade in. Going in with a lighter warm brown pencil, this is the Polychromos Vista. I'm starting to work into those darker parts of the fur, starting here on the eyebrow area. And as I'm shading in, I'm now starting to create fur strokes using a light to medium pressure. Not being super precise at this stage, but just starting to build that texture in the fur as I shade in. Looking at the shadowed areas in the fur, I can see some blue-grey tones in there, above the eye and below on the left side. So I'm using the Luminance Steel Grey to glaze over these areas, using a lighter pressure. Then to really bring out the vibrancy of the fur where the light starts to hit, I'm using the Polychromos Dark Cadmium Yellow, only using a touch of this colour in the eyebrow area and just above the eye. Then I'm taking an orange-brown pencil. This is the Polychromos Burnt Ochre, and I'm continuing to work into those darker areas in the fur. Starting here in this eyebrow area, being a bit more intentional with my fur strokes, and using a slightly heavier pressure in the darker areas. Now I can also see some slight hint of green in the shadowed areas, so I'm using the Polychromos Earth Green, which is a pencil I use quite a lot with fur, and I'm using a lighter pressure to add a touch of colour to the shadowed areas around the eye. Taking the Polychromos Dark Sepia pencil, I'm going back to the eye for a moment to just deepen those shadowed areas, using more of a medium to heavy pressure. And then I'm starting to shade in just above the eye here where it's quite dark, taking the pressure off a little as I shade away from the eye. Using the Luminance Warm Earth 40%, which is a lovely warm brown colour with hints of pink, I'm using this to start building up those warm brown tones around the eye, using a light to medium pressure. I can see a slight hint of purple in the cooler tones around the eye, so I'm taking the Polychromos Purple Violet and I'm adding a slight hint of that colour just around the eye, using a lighter pressure. Now that we've got quite a few of those layers down around the eye, I'm starting to add some more precise details. So I'm taking the Polychromos Payne's Grey, making sure my pencil is sharp. I'm adding in those darker details into the fur around the eye, creating longer strokes here going around the top, using a medium to heavy pressure. Bringing that up into the eyebrow area here. And then creating shorter strokes around the bottom. Then I'm taking the Polychromos Sanguine, which is a brighter orange pencil, but still has that brown tone to it. And I'm just adding to that deeper orange in the fur above the eye, and then adding a touch of this colour to areas around the eye. Then here I go in with the slice tool, as I wanted to bring out some of those fur details coming down into the eye a bit more. But then I realised I wasn't at the right angle, and I didn't have quite enough darker layers to work into, so I abandoned that idea for now. Taking the Payne's Grey pencil, I'm just adding a touch more colour to the eye, using a light to medium pressure to shade over the whole of the iris. And then to add a touch of deeper blue to the reflection, I'm using the Polychromos in Danthorine Blue, only using a very light pressure, as I don't want it to be too dark. Then I'm going over this with the Payne's Grey very lightly, as I can see that it's more of a blue-grey rather than a pure blue colour. And then just to brighten it up a little around the edges, I'm using the Polychromos Light Cobalt Turquoise. Going back to the fur, I'm taking the Luminance Buff Titanium, and I'm now covering the rest of the head, following the direction of the fur as I shade in. And then I'm just lightly erasing the rest of the pencil lines I can see around the head. For the shadowed areas in the fur, I'm using the Cold Grey 231. I've circled the area on the photo where I can see that cooler tone grey on the fur, and I'm using a light to medium pressure to shade into that area. I'm using a bit of a lighter pressure where it's not quite as shadowed at the top. I can also see a lot of pinky peach tones in the fur, so I'm using the Luminance Burnt Ochre 10% to shade in using a lighter pressure. Now I'm just using my eraser to rub out some of the pencil where I can see that highlighted area where the sun hits. And then I'm using the Tombow mono eraser, which is a slightly smaller eraser, just to rub out some of the colour at the top where I can see it's a bit lighter. And then I'm going back in with the burnt ochre 10%. Even though this area is in the shadow and has cooler tones, I can still see the warmth coming through in the fur. Now I can also see some very slight hints of green in the shadowed areas of the fur. So I'm taking the Luminance Middle Verdigris pencil, which is perfect for that colour I can see, and I'm shading in using a lighter pressure. You can always use the Polychromos Earth Green if you don't own this pencil, but it's a little bit darker, so just make sure to keep a lighter pressure. And then for those orange-brown tones in the fur, I'm using the Luminance Brown Ochre 50%, working into those darker areas first, using a light to medium pressure, building those layers up gradually. Another colour I can see in the shadowed areas is a light purple grey tone, so I'm using the Luminance Violet Grey and I'm shading in following the direction of the fur, using a light to medium pressure. Taking the Luminance Silver Grey, I'm continuing to build up those cooler tones in the shadowed area. I can see hints of lighter blue colours coming through, so this is perfect for this. And because this is a Luminance pencil and it's waxy and soft, it's blending those layers down nicely, ready to add some more precise details over the top. Some parts of the fur where the light hits almost look white, So I just want to get a layer of white down using the Museum Aquarelle pencil. This creates a nice smooth base to add layers on top of too. Now that we've got a lot of the base layers down, I'm starting to go in with slightly darker colours now. So I'm using the Luminance French Grey 30% to add in some darker detailing into the shadowed area. Still using a light to medium pressure. And I'm using a sharp pencil as I'm starting to be a little bit more precise with my strokes now. Then going in with the raw umber 50%, which is more of a brown grey colour. I'm doing the same and adding darker details into the shadowed areas, using a slightly heavier pressure in this area around the corner of the eye. Taking a sharp Polychromos burnt umber, I'm starting to add in some warmer dark brown details into those darker areas in the fur, using a light to medium pressure. To bring out some of those brighter warm yellow colours in the fur, I'm using the Luminance Butternut, which is similar to the Burnt Ochre 10%, but a little bit more pigmented. Then I'm taking the Luminance Herculaneum Red, which is a lovely pink peach colour, again similar to the Burnt Ochre 10%, but a little bit more pigmented. And I'm shading into those warm pink areas using a light to medium pressure. Again, I'm using the White Museum Aquarelle pencil to work into those lighter areas of the fur. And then I'm going in with a sharp Polychromos Van Dyke brown, adding some brown details around the eye. Creating darker fur strokes into this eyebrow area. Taking the Luminance French Grey 10%, I'm adding fur details into the lighter areas of the fur. Using a much lighter pressure as I come around the top of the head. Taking the dark sepia pencil again, and working back into the eye to make sure those details in the eye are dark enough, using a medium to heavy pressure. Bringing out some darker strokes around the eye here. To bring out more of that orange-brown colour in the fur, I'm taking the Polychromos Raw Umber, which is quite a vibrant brown pencil, so I'm only adding touches of this colour in the areas where that yellow-brown is more intense. And then here I'm going back in with the middle verdigris pencil to add to those shadowed areas, using a light to medium pressure. I mentioned earlier that I can see some slight hints of brighter blue in the shadowed area, so I'm using the Luminance Light Cobalt Blue to shade into those areas, only using a light to medium pressure. Taking the Van Dyke pencil again, I'm continuing to add in those finer strokes over the top, focusing mainly on those darker areas of the fur. Now that we've got the majority of layers down on this side of the head, I'm now moving on to the other side. And I've already put a layer down of buff titanium, so now I'm going in with the brown ochre 50%, and I'm lightly mapping out where those darker areas are. And then here I'm also working around the eye. Again, I can see some peachy pink tones in the fur, so I'm using the burnt ochre 10% to shade into the fur, using a lighter pressure, pressing on a little harder in the darker areas. And then I just want to add a layer of the Polychromos ivory, which is a light creamy yellow shade. Going back to the top of the head, I'm using the Luminance buff titanium to shade in here. And then I can see a very slight bit of the ear at the top right side here. So I'm just adding in those tufty hairs with the Luminance burnt ochre 10%. Going back over those darker areas of fur, using the Polychromos burnt ochre, using a light to medium pressure. And now annoyingly for this part of the clip, I managed to film about 7 minutes of the footage with the top of the head missed off. I must have been half asleep or something, but hopefully you're still able to follow along. So here I'm just using the Polychromos Dark Sepia to map out the details of the eye. And then whilst I'm here, I'm just adding some more details to the right eye. Working in between those first strokes coming down over the eye. Then going in with the Polychromos Burnt Umber, I'm just bringing out those warm brown tones around the eye. Now using the Polychromos Olive Green Yellowish, I'm shading into the iris. Sorry about my hand being in the way here. You can actually only see a little bit of the eye, as the dog is at a side angle, so there won't be much detail to add here. And then now I'm just using the Cold Grey 232 to add some cooler grey details around the eye. I also just want to add in some light grey strokes here, just at the base of the head, in between the eyes. And then I'm adding in some very light strokes around the top of the head. I'm sorry for this part being cut off. If you'd like to skip to the clip where it's in full shot and you can see what changes I made to the top of the head, I'll put the timestamp on the bottom left corner. Then taking the Burnt Ochre 10% pencil again, I'm continuing to build up those warm peachy tones, working around the top of the head here. I will circle the areas on the reference photo so you can see which bits I was focusing on. Then I'm taking the Luminance French Grey 10% and I'm lightly adding in some neutral grey fur strokes around the head. In this part that you can't see, I'm just continuing to add fur strokes using a light pressure, using an even lighter pressure in those highlighted areas. Going in with the Polychromos Nougat, making sure my pencil is sharp, I'm adding in some darker details into the fur, starting in the eyebrow area here, using a medium to heavy pressure. Lessening the pressure in other areas where it's not quite as dark. Using the Polychromos Sanguine, I'm adding some orangey red tones around the eye here that I can see. Then I'm adding in some light fur strokes around the very edge of the fur. Next up, I'm taking the Polychromos Burnt Ochre and I'm bringing out some longer strokes above the eye here, using a lighter pressure. And then I'm working back into the fur. I'm using a super light pressure here, just to create a bit more shape at the top of the head and bring out those hairs from the ear a bit more. Going along the top of the head here, creating tiny strokes using a very light pressure. Now to go over the whiskers coming out from the side, I'm using the Cold Grey 231. They are obviously white on the photo, but because we're working on white paper, I decided to go with a lighter cold grey, so it's a bit more subtle. And I'm just using the pencil marks underneath as a guide. Going in with the Polychromos Walnut Brown, I'm just bringing out some darker brown strokes from the eye here. Then I'm taking the white Museum Aquarelle to add in that lighter detail around the very edge of the eye. And then I'm just working into the fur, using this to blend the layers of pencil we have down and make everything look a bit smoother. Using the Polychromos cinnamon, I'm continuing to add warmer strokes to the fur, focusing on those darker areas. Taking the white Museum Aquarelle, making sure my pencil is extra sharp, I'm just working in between these darker strokes here. Now to add in that whisker coming down from the eyebrow area, I'm taking the slice tool, as we have enough layers of pencil down now to add this in, and I'm just gently etching into the paper, creating a bit of a curve here. And then I sometimes like to go over the top of the marks I make with a white pencil, and sometimes it's not as clean of a line as I would like. So then now I'm using the white Museum Aquarelle to go over that mark I made with the slice tool, making sure I have an extra sharp pencil for this. Just to mention, if you don't own the slice tool, there are a couple other methods you could use. You could either use an embossing tool to indent the whiskers into the paper before going in with the coloured pencil, or you could even just use the white pencil to create a more subtle whisker over the top. Obviously it would have to be a more pigmented pencil like the white Museum Aquarelle I'm using here. So now I'm just bringing out those hairs a bit more, coming down over the eye, and then just continuing to add lighter hairs to the fur. Once again I'm going in with the Polychromos Dark Sepia, and I'm darkening any details in and around the eye. Creating darker strokes coming down from the eye here. Using the Van Dyke brown pencil, I'm just adding some darker details just to the right of the eye here, at the top of the bridge of the nose, using a light to medium pressure. and then adding fur strokes to the rest of the head. I can see some subtle fur strokes coming over the top of the eye on the left side here, so I'm again taking the slice tool to add in those strokes. Again, I'm not at the best angle here to etch into the paper, so I decided to just use the White Museum Aquarelle instead to go over those strokes. And then I'm quickly taking the dark sepia pencil to just darken the top of the eye here. Taking the Polychromos terracotta, which is a bit of a brighter burnt orange colour. I'm just working into those areas where the orange is more intense, so here at the top of the eye by the eyebrow area. And then also on this eyebrow area on the other side, working into the fur around the eye here. Then taking a white marker pen, this is the Uni Posca pen. I'm just using this to bring out that whisker over the eye a little bit more. And to make it appear a little bit more realistic, I'm not bringing that colour all the way down the whisker, as I want the colour to fade slightly, so we don't have one thick white line. And then I'm doing the same with the other whisker going across, dabbing off any excess with my finger. And now I'm going in with the Luminance French Grey 30% to add any final details to the fur. And then to finish off, I just want to add a touch more of that peachy tone to the centre of the head, so I'm using the burnt ochre 10% to shade into the fur. So there is part 1 of the Golden Labrador complete. Please make sure to give this video a like if you've enjoyed it and would like to see more videos like this. My Patreon is linked down below if you'd like to follow along during the rest of the Golden Labrador with me, and you'll also have access to lots of other in-depth tutorials. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.